Today, much of the Astor family's mansion network exists only as facade, foundation, or footnote. A townhouse divided into luxury apartments, a ballroom converted into retail space, a Newport estate preserved behind ropes and time tickets. What once functioned as a coordinated architecture of power now survives as curated memory. The walls remain, in some cases, the rooms do not. These houses were never isolated dwellings. They were instruments. They regulated access to society. They staged hierarchy. They determined who entered the American elite and who remained outside it. Through corridors, guest lists, dining tables, and staircases, they translated money into permanence. But permanence requires continuity. When the logic that built them, inheritance, discipline, controlled marriage, strategic hospitality, began to fracture, the mansions did not collapse dramatically. They hollowed. Rooms lost their original purpose long before their ownership changed. Staff disappeared. Rituals shortened. The architecture remained upright, but the ideology it housed weakened. This story matters because these buildings were not merely residences of wealth. They were the operating system of an American aristocracy that believed itself durable. Their dispersal marks more than architectural loss. It marks the quiet failure of a class structure that once seemed inevitable. The mansions stand as evidence. What they no longer contain is the point. On a stretch of Fifth Avenue once defined by uniform cornices and controlled facades, reflective glass now rises where limestone townhouses stood in disciplined alignment. The interruption is not architectural variety but structural erasure. The original rhythm of the block, measured, symmetrical, guarded, has dissolved into commercial verticality. What remains of the Astor presence is intermittent, a preserved exterior here, a carved lintel embedded into a modern lobby there. The continuity that once linked these addresses into a coherent network has been severed. A townhouse survives, but not as it was designed to function. Its entrance has been split. What was once a single threshold now opens into separate units. The staircase, originally calibrated to distinguish family movement from staff circulation, serves residents who do not know the logic that shaped its incline. Walls have been inserted where reception rooms once aligned in deliberate procession. The house stands, yet its internal geometry has been altered to meet present utility. It is intact in material but not in purpose. In Newport, a mansion endures under preservation protocols. Velvet ropes regulate entry. Visitors follow predetermined paths through rooms that were once stages for negotiation and ritual. The air is climate-controlled, the furnishings curated, the narratives fixed to placards. The building is stable, even immaculate. Yet it no longer performs the function for which it was constructed. It has shifted from active instrument to retrospective exhibit. Its authority is historical rather than operational. Elsewhere, there are absences. A vacant lot bordered by temporary fencing. A high-rise residential tower occupying land once coordinated within a family-controlled grid. The disappearance is not always visible as loss. In some cases, it is disguised as progress. New development occupies the footprint without acknowledging the system it replaced. The transformation is framed as inevitability, but inevitability obscures agency. The Astor Mansion network was never a loose collection of houses, it was spatially strategic. Townhouses in Manhattan operated in proximity, reinforcing each other's status. Newport estates formed a seasonal extension, allowing influence to migrate without dispersing. Each property was positioned to maintain coherence. Distance was measured carefully. Adjacency signaled alliance. That coherence no longer exists. The properties have been sold, subdivided, institutionalized, or demolished. Ownership has dispersed beyond familial concentration. What was once centrally managed now answers to individual shareholders, boards of trustees, or market forces. The network has ceased to operate as a coordinated organism. Physical survival creates the illusion of continuity. A preserved facade suggests stability. A museum label implies preservation of meaning. Yet the underlying structure, the integrated control of space, capital, and social movement, has dissolved. The buildings no longer communicate with one another. They no longer function as components of a unified strategy. In their current state, they are fragments. Some generate revenue. Some generate tourism. Some generate silence. None generate the systemic authority they once embodied. The rupture is not dramatic. There was no singular moment of collapse. Instead, there is a gradual misalignment between structure and purpose. The walls remain upright, while the logic that animated them has thinned beyond recognition. In Manhattan, zoning maps now define what inheritance once controlled. Parcels that were accumulated deliberately under a single vision had been redistributed through successive transactions, each justified by financial optimization. The concentration of ownership that once allowed coordinated architectural decisions has given way to a pattern of fragmented titles. Legal boundaries have replaced dynastic intention. Where a unified facade once projected consolidated authority, signage now announces retail tenants and private equity firms. Ground floors have been opened to maximize commercial exposure, windows enlarged, interiors stripped to structural frames. The alterations are often precise, professionally executed, even elegant. Yet they are governed by return on investment rather than continuity of purpose. The disappearance of staff is equally telling. These houses were constructed around a dense internal workforce: cooks, footmen, laundresses, secretaries, gardeners. Entire floors were designed for invisible circulation. Service corridors intersected with family spaces at calculated points. Today, such infrastructure is redundant. Modern residences rely on external services or minimal domestic labor. The architectural accommodations for hierarchy no longer correspond to social reality. Spaces once reserved for unseen labor have been repurposed into storage units, mechanical rooms, or additional rentable square footage. In Newport, preservation has introduced a different form of fragmentation. A mansion maintained by a foundation must justify itself annually. Fundraising replaces inheritance as the sustaining mechanism. Docents substitute for private secretaries. The estate's survival depends on public interest, not private authority. The institution persists, but its power dynamic has inverted. Instead of excluding the public to preserve status, it invites the public to secure funding. Even the language surrounding these properties has shifted. They are described as landmarks, assets, heritage sites. The terminology distances them from their original function as instruments of control. The network's coherence depended on discretion and central command. Its remnants are managed through transparency requirements and municipal regulation. The fragmentation is not confined to architecture, it extends to memory. Without centralized stewardship, narratives diverge. One house emphasizes philanthropy. Another highlights architectural innovation. A third focuses on seasonal leisure. The integrated story that once linked Manhattan to Newport, winter to summer, finance to society, has been partitioned into thematic exhibits. The system dissolves into curated episodes. What remains visible is the surface, stonework, columns, iron gates. What remains invisible is the operating logic that once synchronized these elements. The houses no longer signal allegiance to one another. They no longer reinforce a singular authority. In their current condition, the former mansions stand as isolated artifacts within an urban environment driven by liquidity and speed. Their endurance depends not on coordinated governance but on adaptability. Some adapt through commercialization, others through institutionalization, others not at all. The network's disintegration does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through administrative paperwork, renovation permits, quiet sales, through incremental adjustments that, over time, sever the connective tissue. What persists is material. What has vanished is structural unity. The Astor mansions were never designed as private refuges. Their dimensions, their sequences of rooms, their calculated visibility along principal avenues all indicate a different purpose. These structures operated as instruments of social filtration. Entry was not merely physical, it was conditional. A townhouse on Fifth Avenue functioned as a gate. Its doors opened selectively, according to rules that were rarely written yet universally understood within the circle it governed. Invitations were issued with precision. Guest lists were curated as carefully as investment portfolios. The architecture provided the stage upon which inclusion or exclusion was enacted. The arrangement of interior space reinforced this logic. Reception rooms aligned in procession, allowing hosts to regulate movement and proximity. The ballroom, placed at the terminus of this sequence, was not decorative excess. It was a chamber of classification. Here, alliances were introduced, observed, and tacitly evaluated. Marriages were not announced as romantic developments, but recognized as structural consolidations. Staircases, too, were strategic. The grand stair served ceremonial visibility. The service stair preserved operational discretion. Each element maintained hierarchy without overt declaration. The design assumed a society organized by gradation and permanence. The network of mansions amplified this system. Proximity on Fifth Avenue ensured that elite households remained within visual and social range of one another. The urban landscape itself became a map of affiliation. Newport extended this arrangement seasonally. Movement between city and coast preserved cohesion while adapting to climate and ritual. Summer residences were not retreats from authority but relocations of it. Architecture in this context functioned as infrastructure. It enabled the repetition of ritual, dinners, musicals, debutante receptions, charity committees. Repetition was essential. Authority relies on visibility sustained over time. A single event establishes presence. A season of events establishes dominance. The Astor residences formalized cultural authority by defining standards. Dress codes, conversational etiquette, philanthropic priorities, all were modeled within these walls. The houses did not merely host culture. They calibrated it. Those admitted learned the rhythms of the elite by inhabiting its spatial choreography. Comfort was secondary. The scale of these houses often exceeded practical necessity. Maintenance was demanding. Staffing was extensive. Yet efficiency was not the objective. The objective was coherence. Each residence reinforced the others, creating a distributed yet unified structure of influence. To understand their societal function is to recognize that the mansions were not expressions of wealth alone. They were regulatory mechanisms. Through architecture, social boundaries were constructed, maintained, and transmitted. Beyond the reception rooms and ceremonial staircases, the mansions operated as administrative centers of elite continuity. Correspondence was drafted and dispatched daily. Guest lists were revised, compared, and quietly negotiated. Social calendars were synchronized across households to avoid conflict and to reinforce hierarchy. The physical proximity of Astor residences allowed for coordination that extended beyond individual families into a collective framework. Marriage alliances were neither incidental nor purely domestic. They were stabilized within these walls through repeated exposure. Dinners were structured to position certain families beside one another. Seating charts carried strategic weight. A young woman's introduction to society occurred within rooms already calibrated to assess her lineage and prospects. Architecture facilitated this evaluation. Its scale allowed observation without intrusion. Its design ensured that interactions unfolded within a controlled environment. The houses also shaped philanthropic authority. Charity events were not spontaneous gestures but structured affirmations of status. By hosting fundraisers within their own residences, the Astors and their peers signaled stewardship over cultural institutions. Museums, hospitals, and universities often trace their patronage networks back to drawing rooms where commitments were first articulated. The mansion was thus a node connecting private wealth to public influence. Even silence carried meaning. A family not invited to a particular gathering understood its position. Exclusion functioned as a corrective mechanism. The absence of an invitation could recalibrate alliances more effectively than open confrontation. The architecture enabled this subtle governance by providing the stage on which attendance or absence was registered. Seasonal migration reinforced this system rather than dispersing it. In Newport, the spatial hierarchy was replicated on a coastal scale. Estates were positioned to reflect precedence. The order of arrivals signaled standing. Summer did not dilute authority, it reasserted it in a different architectural context. The continuity between Manhattan and Newport ensured that social power remained uninterrupted by geography. The mansions also transmitted codes to younger generations. Children observed the choreography of formal dinners, the discipline of punctuality, the separation between family and staff. They absorbed the expectations embedded in space. The architecture trained them in the maintenance of hierarchy, long before they assumed responsibility for it. What bound the network together was not merely ownership, but repetition. Ritual required infrastructure. Infrastructure required coordination. Each mansion, in isolation, represented significant wealth. Together, they formed a coherent system that regulated entry into American high society. When this system later fragmented, it was not simply the loss of buildings that altered the landscape. It was the dissolution of an architectural framework that had quietly structured elite continuity for decades. Long before limestone facades defined Fifth Avenue, the foundation of the Astor Mansion network existed as acreage and ledger entries. The origin was not architectural but territorial. Manhattan, still uneven and partially rural, offered an opportunity not for display but for consolidation. Parcels were acquired with patience, often on the city's periphery, where growth seemed speculative rather than certain. The capital that enabled these purchases emerged from trade, specifically the fur trade, which linked frontier extraction to European markets. The profits were neither fleeting nor immediately converted into ornament. They were redirected into land. Land offered something trade could not: immobility. It anchored wealth to geography. It reduced volatility. It established permanence. The early Astor strategy was not expansion through spectacle, but accumulation through discretion. Properties were held rather than developed. Streets were plotted with an eye toward future value. As Manhattan expanded northward, land once considered marginal became central. The city grew into holdings already secured. Ownership remained concentrated. Titles were structured to preserve unity across generations. Fragmentation was resisted. Inheritance was managed with discipline, favoring consolidation over dispersal. The objective was not merely to transmit wealth, but to maintain control over territory. Land policy functioned as dynastic architecture long before stone was laid. When the decision to build arose, it followed this geographic logic. Residences were positioned on land already owned or strategically acquired. The placement was deliberate, reinforcing proximity between branches of the family. Townhouses formed contiguous stretches, projecting coherence along the avenue. Architecture expressed a territorial claim that had been secured decades earlier. The mansion network thus emerged as an extension of real estate strategy. These were not isolated homes constructed for comfort. They were vertical assertions built upon horizontal consolidation. Each facade marked the transformation of speculative land into visible authority. This consolidation required restraint. Profits were not dissipated into excessive diversification. Manhattan remained the axis. Revenue from leases and development financed further acquisitions. Control over rental properties generated consistent income, reducing dependence on volatile markets. The family's residential architecture was sustained by commercial holdings embedded in the same grid. Discipline defined the system. Decisions were centralized. Public display remained measured. The emphasis was on durability rather than novelty. The early Astors understood that urban growth, once initiated, would be difficult to reverse. By aligning capital with geography, they positioned themselves to benefit from expansion without constant intervention. The mansions that later defined elite society were therefore not spontaneous expressions of wealth. They were outcomes of accumulated leverage. The land determined the architecture, and the architecture reinforced the land. As Manhattan's grid advanced northward, the Astor holdings did not merely appreciate. They began to structure the city's commercial logic. Leasing, rather than selling, became the governing principle. Buildings erected on Astor land generated rent while preserving underlying ownership. This distinction proved decisive. Income flowed steadily, yet territorial control remained intact. Residential construction followed this same pattern of restraint. The family did not scatter homes across the city in pursuit of novelty. Instead, they anchored themselves within districts already reinforced by their own land strategy. Proximity between branches was intentional. Physical adjacency reduced the risk of internal divergence. The avenue became both corridor and boundary, containing influence within a visible span. Centralization was enforced not only through geography but through governance. Estate management was deliberate. Decisions regarding development, leasing, and construction were filtered through a controlled hierarchy. The objective was continuity. Fragmentation of property would have diluted authority. Legal mechanisms, trusts, and negotiated inheritances ensured that substantial portions of the estate remained unified. The architecture that emerged reflected this consolidation. The mansions were substantial but not experimental. Their facades adhered to established European precedents, signaling alignment with older systems of aristocratic legitimacy. Yet their placement embedded within a rapidly modernizing American city gave them a distinctive function. They were European in form but American in strategy. The residences were built atop income streams derived from surrounding commercial properties. Hotels, office buildings, and rental structures financed the maintenance of domestic grandeur. The mansion network was therefore sustained by an ecosystem of revenue tied directly to the same geography. Wealth did not drift, it circulated within a controlled perimeter. This integration of land policy and domestic architecture created a closed loop. The city's expansion enriched Astor holdings. Those holdings financed the construction and maintenance of elite residences. Those residences, in turn, reinforced the family's authority over the very districts whose growth sustained them. Nothing in this arrangement was accidental. The consolidation of Manhattan real estate predated the visible consolidation of social power. The mansions were not the beginning of influence. They were its architectural manifestation. By the time limestone and brick defined their presence along Fifth Avenue, the underlying system had already matured. Ownership was centralized. Revenue streams were predictable. Succession had been structured to minimize dispersal. The mansion network emerged from this foundation not as an indulgence, but as a calculated extension of territorial command. By the time the Astor mansions stood fully established along Fifth Avenue and in Newport, their authority no longer depended on acquisition. It depended on repetition. The network required daily management as disciplined as any commercial enterprise. Beneath the facades and formal reception rooms operated a structure of routines that sustained coherence across properties. Each house functioned according to a strict internal hierarchy. At the apex stood the family, but below them extended a layered system of domestic labor, butlers overseeing footmen, housekeepers supervising maids, chefs directing kitchen brigades, valets managing personal schedules and attire. Roles were specialized, boundaries were clear. Authority moved vertically and without ambiguity. These hierarchies were not incidental. The architecture had been designed to accommodate them. Service corridors ran parallel to reception rooms, allowing meals and correspondence to move invisibly. Separate staircases ensured that staff circulation never disrupted ceremonial movement. Doors were positioned to open silently at precise intervals. The household operated as a controlled organism, calibrated to preserve continuity of atmosphere. Routine governed the day. Breakfasts were scheduled. Calls were received at designated hours. Correspondence was sorted and answered systematically. Invitations were issued weeks in advance, often in consultation with adjacent households to avoid social conflict. Even spontaneity was structured. An unexpected guest required coordination between kitchen, household staff, and carriage arrangements. The seasonal migration between Manhattan and Newport demanded additional synchronization. As spring approached, preparations began for relocation. Staff lists were reviewed, furnishings were inventoried and transported, gardens were prepared for summer visibility. The transition was not leisurely movement, but logistical orchestration. In Newport, the internal machinery replicated the New York model with adjustments for scale and climate. Large estates required expanded staff complements. Entertainments were more frequent. Guest capacity increased, yet the hierarchy remained intact. The summer season intensified, rather than relaxed, the demand for order. Ritualized dinners formed the visible apex of this internal system. Seating charts were drafted with attention to lineage, influence, and potential alliance. Place settings were arranged symmetrically. Courses were timed precisely. The success of an evening depended not only on cuisine, but on choreography. Conversations were monitored discreetly. Discomfort was corrected through subtle intervention. Controlled guest lists reinforced the network's boundaries. Admission to one house often depended on prior recognition at another. Coordination between households ensured consistency. An invitation extended prematurely could disrupt established hierarchies. The system functioned through alignment. Money sustained this machinery, but it did not animate it. Wealth provided staff wages, maintenance, and decor. What sustained the network was adherence to pattern. The houses were synchronized institutions. Each operated independently in location, yet collectively in purpose. The effectiveness of the system depended not only on hierarchy, but on predictability. Staff members often served for decades. Institutional memory resided as much in the butler's discretion as in family instruction. A seasoned housekeeper understood which linens corresponded to which guests. A valet anticipated adjustments in attire according to subtle shifts in company. Continuity of personnel reinforced continuity of culture. Financial administration paralleled domestic order. Accounts were reviewed with precision. Expenditures on food, coal, floral arrangements, and carriage maintenance were logged methodically. The cost of maintaining multiple residences was substantial, yet it was absorbed into a broader estate structure supported by rental income and land revenue. Oversight prevented excess from undermining stability. Communication between properties was constant. Telegrams confirmed arrival dates. Correspondence coordinated overlapping invitations. The network operated through awareness. A reception in Manhattan required acknowledgement in Newport. A marriage prospect introduced at one dinner was observed again in another setting. Social evaluation unfolded across locations. Temporal discipline reinforced this structure. The winter season in New York followed a known sequence of events: operas, private balls, charity functions. Summer in Newport intensified these rhythms with outdoor fetes and extended house parties. Each season possessed its own cadence, yet both were integrated into a single annual cycle. Disruption of that cycle would have signaled instability. Even leisure was regulated. Afternoons allocated for calls adhered to specific hours. Garden walks, musical performances, and carriage rides were opportunities for visible participation in a shared code. Absence from these rituals required explanation. Presence reaffirmed allegiance. The machinery functioned with minimal public display of strain. Conflicts were managed privately. Financial pressures, when they emerged, were absorbed quietly within the estate's administrative apparatus. The objective was uninterrupted performance. The houses projected ease because their operations were disciplined. Children raised within this environment encountered structure before autonomy. Instruction in etiquette paralleled observation of staff protocol. They learned when to speak, where to stand, how to enter a room already in motion. Architecture and routine collaborated to imprint hierarchy as natural order. What distinguished the Astor network was synchronization. Individual households did not compete for dominance. They reinforced one another. A dinner invitation carried weight because it aligned with a broader framework of recognition. The system reduced unpredictability by standardizing interaction. In this way, the mansions transcended domestic function. They became coordinated sites of governance within elite society. Routine transformed wealth into authority, and repetition ensured that authority appeared unchallenged. At its height, the Astor Mansion network no longer required assertion. Its authority was assumed. The alignment between land, architecture, routine, and reputation had matured into an unspoken hierarchy that structured American high society with minimal overt enforcement. The facades along Fifth Avenue were not merely residences, they were markers of precedence. Their uniform scale and disciplined ornamentation signaled stability rather than experimentation. To build nearby was to seek proximity to an established order. To be received within was to be acknowledged by it. The Astor name functioned as a standard. Conduct at dinners, expectations of dress, even the cadence of conversation reflected a model calibrated within these houses. Deviations were noted quietly. Compliance granted access. The mansions did not broadcast rules, yet they defined them through repetition. Cultural patronage reinforced this authority. Donations to museums, orchestras, and charitable institutions were often initiated within drawing rooms before becoming public commitments. Support for the arts was not casual generosity, it was strategic positioning. By underwriting cultural infrastructure, the network extended its influence beyond domestic space into the civic realm. Architectural decisions during this period reflected confidence. Renovations refined rather than expanded. Interiors were updated to maintain relevance without sacrificing continuity. The objective was not novelty, but reinforcement of established taste. The houses projected permanence because permanence had become credible. The network also served as arbiter of social legitimacy. Invitations to significant events, winter balls, formal dinners, summer receptions, operated as credentials. Attendance confirmed standing. Exclusion communicated limits. The process was subtle yet widely understood. What distinguished this apex was cohesion. Competing fortunes existed elsewhere in the city, yet the Astor network maintained a gravitational center. Other elites measured themselves against its standards. New wealth sought recognition through alignment, not confrontation. The mansions, operating in concert, created an environment in which wealth translated seamlessly into authority. There was no visible disjunction between economic capital and social influence. Each reinforced the other. In this period, architecture, inheritance, and reputation were synchronized. The system appeared stable not because it resisted change, but because change was absorbed without disturbing its core alignment. During this period, the network did more than host society, it calibrated it. Debutante introductions were not isolated ceremonies, but structured affirmations of continuity. A young woman's formal entrance into society, conducted within these drawing rooms, reaffirmed lineage as qualification. The ritual reinforced hierarchy across generations, binding past and future within a single performance. The press, though increasingly attentive to elite life, operated at a distance defined by the houses themselves. Public visibility was managed. Appearances at charity galas or opera openings were permitted within bounds that preserved dignity. The Astor network did not seek spectacle. It allowed recognition on its own terms. Authority remained grounded in discretion. The mansions also functioned as informal councils. Conversations held in private libraries or after-dinner gatherings influenced philanthropic boards, educational trusteeships, and cultural commissions. Decisions shaping public institutions often trace their origins to exchanges conducted within these rooms. The boundary between domestic and civic authority blurred without becoming overtly political. Economic security underwrote this alignment. Rental income from commercial properties ensured that domestic display was not reliant on financial volatility. Stability of revenue permitted long-term commitments to cultural patronage and maintenance. The houses were not sustained through speculation, but through embedded land control. The spatial network reinforced solidarity. Proximity allowed swift consultation. If one household planned a major event, others adjusted their calendars accordingly. The system reduced competition within its own ranks, presenting a unified front to the broader elite landscape. Alignment enhanced credibility. This was the moment when wealth, architecture, and authority converged fully. The facades projected permanence, the routine sustained it, the reputation confirmed it. Social arbitration occurred without formal decree because the network's legitimacy was rarely questioned. Other fortunes rose during this era, often larger in industrial scale. Yet industrial wealth sought validation within the existing framework. Invitations from the Astor houses conferred acceptance that financial success alone could not secure. The network defined entry into the highest tier of society. At the consolidated apex, the mansions were not merely structures of residence or ceremony. They were instruments of calibration, maintaining a coherent order through ritual, proximity, and disciplined governance. The system operated with such fluency that its endurance seemed assured. Pressure did not arrive as spectacle. It accumulated gradually, first as background noise, then as structural strain. Industrial expansion altered the scale of American wealth. Fortunes derived from railroads, steel, oil, and finance began to eclipse the earlier accumulations rooted in land and trade. These new fortunes were liquid, mobile, and often impatient. They did not inherit Manhattan. They entered it with capital prepared to compete. The city itself intensified. Commercial districts expanded northward. Apartment buildings rose in proximity to single-family townhouses. The density that once reinforced exclusivity began to compress it. Streets previously defined by continuity of facade now faced vertical interruption. Proximity no longer guaranteed cohesion. Manhattan real estate values climbed accordingly. Parcels once secured for stability acquired speculative appeal. The underlying land beneath a mansion became, in some cases, more valuable than the structure upon it. A residence that had functioned as a node within a coordinated system now represented potential liquidity. This shift introduced a new calculus. Maintenance costs for large houses were substantial. Staffing, coal, repairs, seasonal migration all required sustained expenditure. When compared against rising land values, the opportunity cost of retention became visible. To preserve a mansion was to forgo profit that the market increasingly rewarded. Taxation compounded the pressure. As municipal and federal policies evolved, holding extensive property incurred higher obligations. Estate planning grew more complex. Inheritance structures designed to preserve unity now had to navigate legal frameworks that penalized concentrated wealth. The mechanisms that once secured continuity required adaptation. Simultaneously, generational perspective shifted. Heirs raised within the disciplined routines of the network encountered a society less deferential to inherited authority. Industrial magnates asserted cultural presence through philanthropy and architecture of their own. Clubs, hotels, and new avenues of influence diversified the elite landscape. The social code that had governed invitations and alliances weakened not through rebellion but through dilution. Recognition no longer flowed exclusively through Fifth Avenue drawing rooms. Competing centers of gravity emerged, offering validation independent of the Astor framework. Internally, The network confronted division. Different branches assessed their holdings with varying priorities. Some favored preservation of precedent. Others recognized financial incentives in sale or redevelopment. Centralized discipline faced erosion as individual interests gained prominence. The mansions, once secure in alignment, now stood at the intersection of conflicting forces: market appreciation, fiscal policy, evolving taste, and generational reconsideration. None alone was sufficient to fracture the system. Together, they introduced strain. The network remained intact in appearance. Dinners continued. Seasons rotated. Yet beneath the surface, calculations shifted. The question was no longer solely how to maintain coherence, but whether coherence justified its cost. As land valuations escalated, redevelopment ceased to be theoretical. Developers approached with proposals framed as modernization. A townhouse could be replaced with a commercial structure yielding far greater return. The proposition was not framed as abandonment, but as rational adaptation to urban growth. In some cases, leases provided transitional compromise. Portions of land were rented for temporary structures. Adjacent parcels were consolidated for larger projects. Each decision appeared incremental, yet incremental adjustments began to disrupt the visual and operational continuity that had defined the network. Industrial wealth also altered the architecture of prestige. New residences appeared in alternative districts, some grander in scale, others more experimental in design. Hotels and private clubs offered environments that rivaled domestic drawing rooms as sites of influence. The monopoly on arbitration weakened as alternative platforms for recognition gained legitimacy. Public visibility intensified. Newspapers increasingly reported on elite gatherings, cataloging attendance and expenditure. Discretion became harder to maintain. Social authority, once sustained through controlled access, now unfolded within a more exposed environment. Visibility expanded beyond the network's capacity to regulate it fully. Within families, differing assessments of obligation emerged. For some, stewardship remained paramount. For others, diversification of assets offered prudence. The concentrated geographic strategy that had once secured advantage now presented risk through overexposure to a single urban market. Debate, previously contained within established hierarchies, grew more pronounced. Maintenance costs, though long absorbed without strain, became more conspicuous in contrast to potential liquidation values. A mansion required ongoing investment simply to preserve its facade and internal order. Meanwhile, market offers represented immediate capitalization. The discipline that had resisted fragmentation encountered tangible temptation. Seasonal migration, once a reinforcement of cohesion, began to reveal fissures. Attendance fluctuated. Some heirs favored extended travel abroad. Others reduced their participation in formal rituals. The annual cycle, though still observed, lost uniformity. Variation introduced unpredictability into a system that had depended upon synchronization. None of these pressures singularly dismantled the network. Rather, they shifted the balance between preservation and adaptation. The houses still stood. Invitations were still issued. Yet the underlying consensus that had sustained total alignment between wealth, architecture, and authority no longer operated without question. The entry of pressure marked the moment when continuity required deliberate defense rather than habitual maintenance. The system confronted a landscape in which its assumptions about land, inheritance, and social centrality were no longer unchallenged. The shift did not begin with demolition, it began with appraisal. Land once held for continuity was now assessed for yield. The language surrounding the mansions changed subtly. They were described less as seats of coordination and more as holdings, properties within a portfolio. Their value was calculated not in terms of influence, but in market comparison. Sales occurred discreetly at first. A parcel at the edge of the network. A townhouse requiring extensive repair. The transactions were justified as practical adjustments. Yet each sale altered adjacency. The visual coherence of the avenue thinned. The architectural dialogue between houses grew intermittent. Subdivision followed. A residence designed for a single lineage was divided into multiple units. Floors were separated. Entrances reconfigured. Where once a central staircase unified ceremonial space, partitions created vertical isolation. The building persisted physically, but its spatial logic was interrupted. Inheritance accelerated this fragmentation. Estates distributed across heirs did not always reconsolidate. Financial obligations, taxes, settlements, independent investments required liquidity. Liquidation of property became a mechanism to satisfy division. Centralized discipline gave way to individual discretion. Maintenance costs continued to rise. Stone facades required restoration. Roofing demanded replacement. Staffing models designed for hierarchical households no longer aligned with contemporary domestic life. The infrastructure that had once sustained authority appeared excessive relative to diminished social function. Cultural necessity declined in parallel. Elite society no longer depended exclusively on private drawing rooms for validation. Hotels, clubs, and public institutions provided alternative venues. The mansion's role as arbiter weakened. Without that function, its scale became burdensome rather than strategic. Repurposing emerged as compromise. A townhouse converted into offices. An estate adapted into an institutional headquarters. Adaptive reuse preserved structure while redefining purpose. Yet each adaptation moved the building further from its original ideological framework. The network ceased to operate as coordinated infrastructure. Individual properties responded to individual incentives. Synchronization dissolved. What had once functioned as a distributed system of authority now behaved as separate assets subject to market logic. Architecture remained visible. Limestone facades endured. Iron gates stood intact. But the ideology embedded within their arrangement, centralized control, disciplined inheritance, regulated access, no longer governed their operation. Extraction replaced stewardship, not through hostility, but through recalculation. The rationale for preservation shifted from maintaining cohesion to maximizing return. In that recalculation, continuity became negotiable. As transactions multiplied, the pattern became structural rather than incidental. Parcels once contiguous under a single estate map were dispersed across unrelated owners. Architectural decisions that had once required internal consensus now answered to independent interests. Renovations reflected tenant demands rather than inherited codes. Where ballrooms had mediated alliances, conference rooms emerged. Where libraries had hosted private consultation, commercial signage appeared. The transformation was rarely abrupt. It unfolded through renovation permits, zoning variances, and refinancing agreements. Each document formalized a departure from coordinated governance. Institutional acquisition introduced a different form of detachment. Foundations and universities purchased properties for administrative use. Their stewardship preserved facades, but detached them from the network that had given them collective meaning. Preservation became selective. Rooms were restored for aesthetic significance, while operational spaces were altered beyond recognition. The social consequences were less visible but equally definitive. Without synchronized households, invitations lost their systemic weight. A gathering in one repurposed townhouse no longer implied reinforcement by neighboring residences. The logic of adjacency, once central to authority, dissolved into coincidence. Generational inheritance further diluted concentration. Heirs diversified geographically and financially. Manhattan real estate ceased to represent the exclusive axis of family identity. Capital dispersed into securities, international holdings, and ventures detached from the original grid. The mansion, once emblem of territorial command, became an optional asset among many. The aesthetic persistence of architecture masked the ideological shift. A passerby could still observe carved cornices and symmetrical windows and infer stability. Yet the governance embedded in those facades had been replaced by contractual obligation and market responsiveness. Stewardship had implied continuity across time, maintenance undertaken not for immediate gain but for inherited responsibility. Extraction introduced temporal compression. Decisions were evaluated according to present value. Future cohesion held less weight than current liquidity. By the time multiple properties had been sold, subdivided, or institutionalized, the network's connective tissue had thinned beyond recovery. Remaining houses stood without the reinforcing presence of adjacent allies. They were no longer components within a system, but survivors within a marketplace. The mansions endured as structures. Their ideological function, coordinated arbitration of elite society, did not. In the absence of cohesion, preservation emerged as a final strategy of containment. Certain estates were transferred to foundations or heritage organizations. Their survival depended not on lineage, but on governance structures designed to stabilize memory. Endowments replaced inheritance. trustees replaced family councils. The objective shifted from sustaining authority to safeguarding appearance. Rooms were restored to approximate a particular year. Furnishings were catalogued. Wallpapers replicated from archival fragments. The selection of what to preserve required interpretation. A drawing room might be frozen in its most ornate phase, even if it had evolved across decades. Preservation privileges a moment. It cannot accommodate continuous adaptation. Public access redefined the relationship between architecture and audience. Visitors entered spaces once restricted by invitation. Ropes demarcated boundaries previously enforced by hierarchy. Interpretive plaques narrated the functions of rooms whose original use had depended on discretion. The houses became legible in ways they had never intended. This transparency altered scale. A ballroom designed to accommodate controlled spectacle now hosted guided tours. Footsteps echoed where conversation once calibrated alliances. The choreography remained visible in form but absent in consequence. Elsewhere, erasure was more complete. Demolition removed structures whose maintenance could not be justified. In their place rose towers of glass and steel, responsive to contemporary density. The disappearance left little trace beyond historical photographs and parcel records. Absence replaced adaptation. Preservation itself introduced fragmentation. Each estate developed its own curatorial emphasis. Architecture, decorative arts, seasonal leisure. Without the original network to contextualize them collectively, these houses stand as isolated examples rather than components of a coordinated system. Visitors encounter them individually, not relationally. Institutional stewardship ensures structural survival. Roofs are repaired, foundations stabilized. Yet the economic model underpinning preservation depends on ticket sales, grants, and public interest. The houses must justify themselves through education and tourism. Their authority derives from interpretation, not control. The atmosphere within preserved rooms is carefully maintained, temperature regulated, light filtered, objects positioned to evoke continuity. Yet the vitality that once animated these spaces cannot be reconstructed through arrangement alone. What survives is aesthetic memory architecture, furnishings, spatial proportion. What does not survive is the regulatory function that bound multiple houses into unified influence. Within preserved estates, time is curated rather than lived. A specific era is selected, stabilized, and repeated for successive audiences. Docents recount patterns of service, seasonal rhythms, and social ritual. Yet narration cannot restore the embedded authority that once animated these spaces. The houses are interpreted as artifacts, not exercised as instruments. Institutional frameworks introduce neutrality. Governance by board resolution replaces dynastic command. Financial sustainability requires public programming, educational outreach, and donor cultivation. The estate must articulate relevance beyond lineage. It becomes a cultural resource rather than a private mechanism of arbitration. This transformation alters spatial meaning. A dining room arranged for historical accuracy no longer regulates alliance, it illustrates it. The choreography of seating survives as explanation, not enforcement. Architecture retains proportion and ornament, but its capacity to structure contemporary hierarchy has evaporated. For properties that vanished entirely, memory relies on archival reconstruction. Photographs, blueprints, and written accounts preserve outline without substance. The absence of physical structure erases the tactile dimension of influence. A demolished facade cannot convey adjacency or territorial continuity. It can only be remembered. The surviving houses, whether museums or adapted institutions, stand without their former counterparts. The coherence that once linked Manhattan to Newport, winter to summer, lineage to land, has dissolved into singular narratives. Each site preserves its own fragment of the past, but none reconstructs the network. Public admiration often centers on craftsmanship and scale. Marble staircases, carved wood paneling, landscaped gardens, all command attention. Yet aesthetic endurance should not be confused with systemic survival. The infrastructure that once synchronized these properties no longer operates. The network as system is gone. What remains are structures reclassified as heritage, isolated from the territorial strategy and coordinated governance that produced them. Preservation ensures that walls and ornament persist. It cannot revive the ideological architecture that once moved through those rooms. In their institutional afterlife, the mansions stand stable and interpreted, visible, accessible, and detached from the authority that once rendered them central. The surviving facades do not argue. They endure. Limestone blocks remain aligned. Windows hold their symmetry. Cornices project with the same measured confidence they once displayed along uninterrupted avenues. To a casual observer, permanence appears intact. Architecture suggests stability long after the system that produced it has dissolved. Yet walls reveal by omission as much as by presence. The Astor mansion network was constructed upon disciplined cohesion. Land was consolidated, inheritance was structured, rituals were synchronized. Authority flowed through adjacency and repetition. The endurance of the system depended not merely on wealth but on coordination, on the capacity of multiple households to operate as a single organism. When that cohesion weakened, the architecture remained. It did not collapse. It did not betray its own design. Instead, it stood unchanged while the logic animating it thinned. Stone cannot enforce alignment. Staircases cannot compel consensus. A facade cannot preserve centralized governance once it disperses. The transformation exposes a distinction between material durability and structural continuity. Buildings can survive alterations in ownership, function, and audience. They can adapt to institutional stewardship or commercial reinvention. But the ideological framework that once bound them together cannot be restored through preservation alone. The walls reveal that permanence in elite systems is conditional. It relies on sustained discipline across generations. Geographic concentration, if not reinforced by shared intention, becomes vulnerable to market incentive. Inheritance, if not unified by consensus, fragments capital. Ritual, if not collectively maintained, loses regulatory force. Architecture may project timelessness, yet it remains dependent on governance. The Astor network illustrates that even carefully consolidated power can dissipate without visible rupture. The erosion is administrative before it is architectural. It occurs in estate divisions, in sales agreements, in reclassifications of use. The facades remain instructive. They demonstrate how effectively architecture can embody authority when aligned with economic strategy and social control. They also demonstrate the limits of stone when separated from the system that animated it. The question that lingers is not whether the mansions were grand. It is whether the cohesion that sustained them could have adapted without dissolving. The network's trajectory suggests that permanence was never inherent, only maintained. Its durability depended on continuous alignment between land policy, inheritance discipline, and social arbitration. When even one of these elements loosened, the structure did not immediately fail, but it became susceptible to gradual divergence. The rigidity that once protected cohesion may also have constrained adaptation. Concentrated geographic investment amplified influence during expansion, yet it magnified exposure when urban economics shifted. A code of exclusivity preserved hierarchy, yet it limited flexibility as alternative centers of prestige emerged. Discipline ensured continuity, yet it narrowed the pathways through which renewal might occur. The mansions reveal that elite systems operate within tension between preservation and adjustment. Too little discipline invites fragmentation. Too much resistance to change accelerates obsolescence. The Astor network achieved extraordinary alignment at its height precisely because it minimized deviation. That same minimization restricted its capacity to reconfigure when pressures intensified. What endures in stone is evidence of strategy executed with precision. What does not endure is the consensus required to perpetuate that strategy across shifting contexts. Architecture, no matter how deliberate, cannot substitute for collective intention. The surviving houses, whether preserved or repurposed, stand as documents of a system that once synchronized wealth, territory, and social authority. Their proportions still communicate order. Their ornament still signals confidence. Yet their isolation underscores the fragility of cohesion when dispersed among competing incentives. The unresolved question remains suspended within these facades. Was fragmentation inevitable in a city defined by acceleration and diversification? Or did the very mechanisms that secured dominant centralization, exclusivity, territorial concentration limit the network's capacity to evolve? The walls do not answer. They persist as material record, stable and composed, bearing witness to a structure of power that required more than stone to endure.